History often treats power as something loud, conquests, battles, declarations, but the most important decisions are usually silent. Long after her death, Hatshepsut began to disappear. Not suddenly, not in anger, not during chaos. Her name was removed carefully. Her images were altered quietly. Her memory was dismantled, piece by piece.
This was not revenge. If it had been, it would have happened immediately. Instead, the delay reveals something far more unsettling: calculation. Hatshepsut was not erased because she failed. She was erased because she worked. She ruled openly, successfully, for decades.
She did not hide behind a regent's title. She did not pretend to be temporary. She ruled as a full pharaoh, publicly, confidently, and with results. And in doing so, she proved something dangerous: that the system of kingship could bend further than it was ever meant to. Once that proof existed, it could not be allowed to remain.
But systems do not erase themselves. They act through people. And in this case, the name that history gives us is Thutmose III. Thutmose III is remembered as one of Egypt's greatest warrior kings, a brilliant commander, a relentless conqueror, a ruler who expanded Egypt's influence farther than any pharaoh before him.
All of this may be true, but it does not explain why Hatshepsut disappeared. Because Thutmose III did not rise through a phronetic overthrow. He was not erased, imprisoned, or killed. During Hatshepsut's reign, he was alive, visible, and present within the court. He waited. And when her rule ended, Egypt did not collapse.
The administration continued to function. The temples remained active. The granaries still filled. The Nile still rose and fell. There was no emergency that demanded a purge. And that is exactly what made the erasure possible. Because systems do not correct themselves during crisis. They correct themselves after stability returns.
Only when order feels secure can the past be safely edited. If Hatshepsut had been erased out of rage, it would have happened immediately. If it had been personal, it would have been sudden and violent. But years passed. Campaigns succeeded. Authority solidified. The throne looked unshakable. Only then did the removal begin.
This timing matters. It reveals intent. Power does not rewrite history when it feels threatened. It rewrites history when it feels safe. When survival is uncertain, memory is a luxury. But when order is restored, memory becomes dangerous. Hatshepsut's reign was not merely an anomaly. It was proof.
Proof that tradition was flexible. Proof that a woman could wear the full symbols of kingship. Proof that the divine image of rule could be adjusted and still work. And proof is what systems fear most, because proof can be repeated. So the correction was made quietly. Names in cartouches were replaced. Reliefs were altered to restore familiar patterns. Statues were defaced, buried, or repurposed. Faces were chipped away. Titles were scraped down to stone. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough to break the chain of memory.
The goal was not to convince the people living at the time. Many of them already knew what had happened. The goal was to control what later generations would be able to cite, to make her reign harder to reference, harder to defend, harder to use as precedent. And that takes us to the real point of this story.
Empires do not erase people. They erase possibilities.
Hatshepsut was dangerous not because she ruled, but because she ruled successfully. She did not bring chaos. She did not weaken Egypt. She did not shatter the state. She proved the system could bend without breaking. And once a system bends without breaking, it can never again claim that it is unchangeable. That was the threat. As long as her memory remained visible, future rulers could point to it. They could say, "It has happened before." They could ask, "Why not again?"
Power depends on inevitability, on the idea that things are the way they are because they must be, because the gods intended it, because nature intended it, because history intended it. Hatshepsut exposed that inevitability as a story, useful but not absolute. So the response was not punishment, it was containment. The system did not try to deny that she had ruled. It tried to make her irrelevant, unreadable, unquotable, unusable. This is why the erasure was selective. Some monuments survived. Some references remained. Enough to avoid an obvious hole in the record, but never enough to let the full narrative stand clearly in the open. History was not destroyed. It was edited. And now we return to Thutmose III. It is tempting to turn him into the villain, to imagine jealousy or personal hatred. But that interpretation is too simple, and it misses how systems actually work. Thutmose III did not need to be cruel to play this role. He did not need to be obsessed. He only needed to be ideal. He was not a radical, not an outsider, not a disruptor. He was exactly what the system wanted to present as normal. A legitimate male heir, a successful military leader, a ruler who expanded Egypt's power rather than questioning it, a king whose victories made the dynasty look strong and unbroken. He represented continuity, and continuity is the most valuable currency of any long-lived state. Through him, Egypt could tell a simpler story about itself, a story where kingship had always followed the same pattern, where deviations were temporary, and where power always returned to its proper shape. This is why the erasure did not need an announcement. No decree was required. No public confession. The correction could happen in the background because the surface of the system looked stable again. Under Thutmose III, the state no longer looked bent, so it could quietly remove the evidence that it ever had been. Look closely at what that kind of editing requires. It is labor, it is time, it is coordination.
Someone has to decide which walls matter and which do not. Which temples will be corrected and which will be ignored. Which names will be replaced and with what? Which statues will be broken and which will simply be buried where no one will see them again.
That is not how a personal vendetta behaves. A vendetta burns hot and fast. It is emotional. It is messy. This was administrative. It moved like paperwork, like an audit, like a careful attempt to make the official record match the story the state wanted to tell.
And that is why the delay is so revealing. Because a delay means debate. It means planning. It means someone waited for the right moment, when the correction would not risk destabilizing the present. In other words, the erasure was not meant to solve a problem in Hatshepsut's time. It was meant to prevent a problem in the future.
Think about the message embedded in that decision. Egypt was willing to accept Hatshepsut while it needed her. while the court required stability, while the transition of power still carried risk, while the state was not yet ready to close the chapter. But once the chapter was safely closed, the system returned to its deeper instinct: restore the template. Because templates are what keep complex systems running. They reduce uncertainty. They make succession look predictable. They make obedience feel natural.
A successful exception breaks the template. So the system has to do one of two things: rewrite the template to include the exception, or erase the exception to protect the template. Egypt chose to protect the template.
This is also why the story can't be reduced to one man versus one woman. Even if Thutmose III personally felt nothing, the state still had incentives to simplify the past. Priests, officials, heirs, and future kings all benefited from a cleaner narrative. A cleaner narrative makes legitimacy easier to claim.
And legitimacy, more than armies, more than gold, is what holds empires together. Without legitimacy, a dynasty becomes a temporary occupation. With legitimacy, power becomes tradition.
So when you see Hatshepsut's cartouches scraped away, you are not just seeing vandalism. You are seeing the maintenance of legitimacy, the repair of a story, the reinforcement of a rule that must appear timeless. This is why the edits are so haunting. They are not the fingerprints of chaos. They are the fingerprints of order.
And that brings us to the most uncomfortable thought. If a system can erase a successful ruler, not because she was weak, but because she proved the system could be different, then the past we inherit is always incomplete. Not because history is accidentally lost, but because it is intentionally managed.
And once you understand that, you begin to notice it everywhere. Not only in Egypt, but in any institution that needs to appear inevitable. Because the most dangerous thing in politics is not failure, it is a working alternative. That is the real shadow behind Thutmose III's restoration.
He did not simply return Egypt to business as usual. He helped the state declare silently, "This is what power is supposed to look like." And once that declaration is carved into stone, future generations grow up believing it was always true. That is how systems survive. Not by being honest about their flexibility, but by hiding it.
Not by admitting their exceptions, but by burying them. And that is why Hatshepsut still matters. Even after the erasure, her existence leaks through the cracks. Fragments remain, ruins whisper, and scholars, thousands of years later, can still reconstruct the outline of what the state tried to remove. Which means the final irony is this:
The very act of erasing her became the evidence that she mattered. Because only a truly dangerous precedent is worth that much effort to destroy.